Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar focusing on navigating the EU Green Deal landscape with us, Goodbody Clearstream. First, I'd like to start with a little bit about us and who we are. So we are Goodbody Clearstream and we are Ireland's leading corporate climate, ESG and sustainability services solution provider with blue chip client base and a deep practical knowledge and expertise. We assist a wide variety of organizations to measure, implement, and report best in class sustainability practices in their businesses with their products and their supply chains. Goodbody Clearstreams is a subsidiary of Goodbody, a financial services business. We are one of Europe's leading carbon sustainability and ESG solution providers. We work with over 140 clients from a wide variety of industries. Some of the industries are highlighted there. We have construction, pharmaceuticals, food and beverage, agriculture, and much more. Some of our key services include corporate climate change strategy, carbon footprinting, climate target setting, responsible business strategy, and implementation, ESG reporting, responsible sourcing, product footprint, circular economy, and sustainability learning programs. My name is Kate Bean. I'm a director here in Goodbody Clearstream, specialising in the supply chain and responsible sourcing. And I'm joined with Orla Butler and Colm Hogan, who are our specialists today in all things EU Green Deal legislation and regulation. In today's short session, we'll be giving you a brief summary on some of the key pieces of EU Green Deal legislation and regulation. We'll break this down into three distinct buckets. So sourcing legislation, product consumer regulation, and ESG reporting. Unfortunately, given the kind of tight time restraints today, we'll not be covering a Q&A session at the end of our webinar, but we'd be happy to hear from you after the session today. And our email will be linked at the end of the slide deck, which will be shared with you along with the recording after our webinar. Just to kind of start off, we'll look at a bit of context. The ESG regulatory landscape in the European Union has rapidly evolved in recent years, driven by the European Green Deal and the EU's commitment to achieving net zero by 2050. A robust framework of ESG regulation has been developed to enhance transparency, direct capital flows towards sustainable investments and mitigate greenwashing. However, this landscape has grown increasingly complex recently, particularly in light of the EU Omnibus proposal. This proposal has introduced uncertainty for market participants who are trying to adapt to overlapping timelines, evolving definitions, and consistent implementation across member states. This complexity is further compounded by the global political landscape, where divergent ESG approaches are emerging. In the US, for example, ESG faces increasing political polarization, while jurisdictions like the UK and APAC are developing parallel but not always aligned regulatory frameworks. Colm and Orla will now take us through the scope and implications of 11 pieces of key EU Green Deal regulation and legislations, which will hopefully give you some oversight into what may be relevant to your company and assist us through these murky waters. Over to you, Colm.
Thanks, Kate. So I'm going to go through some pieces of sourcing legislation first. So to start off with, the forced labour regulation. This regulation aims to eliminate all products made with forced labour from the EU market, regardless of whether they're produced inside or outside the EU. The forced labour regulation does so by requiring EU member states to establish control systems and monitoring authorities to enforce compliance. It comes into effect on the 14th of December 2027, as outlined in this slide, giving companies a transition period to adapt. The scope is wide. It applies to all companies selling goods in the EU, and it covers the entire supply chain from raw materials right through to finished goods. Companies, as part of this regulation, will be required to carry out risk assessments and show clear evidence that forced labour is not present in any part of their supply chain. Failure to comply could lead to fines, bans on the import, sale or export of affected goods, and potentially orders to dispose of these products. Next, the EUDR, or the European Union Deforestation Regulation. This targets deforestation linked to specific commodities. So from the 30th of June 2025, companies placing products such as the 7 listed, so cattle, cocoa, coffee, soy, palm oil, wood and rubber, they must prove these do not come from recently deforested land. There are three key requirements. First, companies must report geolocation data for where the commodity was sourced. Secondly, they must submit a due diligence declaration to the EU related to the product in question. And thirdly, they must confirm the product was produced in line with local laws, including laws related to human rights. The scope of this regulation includes both EU and non-EU companies. Failure to comply can lead to fines of up to 9% of the company's turnover, so pretty significant. Thirdly, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, referred to commonly as CBAM. This requires reporting of greenhouse gas emissions factors for importers of carbon-intensive goods, such as iron, steel, aluminium, cement, fertilizers, electricity, and hydrogen. If a company imports over 50 tons of these goods per year into the EU, it must become an authorized CBAM importer. It must submit regular CBAM declarations, and it must purchase CBAM certificates to offset the embedded carbon emissions. Currently, CBAM is in a transitional phase, so full implementation will begin in 2026, and the obligation to buy certificates will kick in by February 2027. Non-compliance, again, with CBAM can be expensive, so fines range from €10 to €50 per unreported ton of emissions, and reduced penalties are possible for minor good faith errors. It remains to be seen how this will play out in practice. And finally, for sourcing legislation, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. This directive introduces mandatory due diligence for both human rights and environmental impacts in the supply chain. The aim is to prevent harm to workers, communities, and ecosystems by enforcing responsible business conduct across the supply chain. Implementation of this directive will be phased in starting from 2027, and the first wave of in-scope companies include those with over 5,000 employees and €1.5 billion global turnover. This includes non-EU companies generating the same amount within the EU. The directive zeroes in on high-risk sectors such as agriculture, mining, and textiles, and will require companies to embed due diligence in their operations, actively monitor their supply chains, and report on their efforts to do so. Non-compliance can lead to civil liability and fines of at least 5% of global turnover. It's important to note here that amendments were proposed on the 26th of February 2025 as part of an omnibus package, which is currently being negotiated in the European Union. So keep an eye on this as it develops, and we will keep you posted on our website and on our socials as well. So to conclude, each of these regulations reflect a growing push by the EU to hold businesses accountable for social and environmental impacts of their operations and supply chains. Whether it's banning forced labour, ensuring deforestation-free goods, cutting carbon at the border of the EU, or mandating due diligence, these frameworks are and will continue to reshape how the EU does business. I'll pass you over to my colleague Orla, who will talk to you about product and consumer regulations.
Thanks, Colm. Yeah, like Colm said, I'll be talking through product and consumer legislation. So we're moving from the sourcing end of the supply chain up to the product-specific end. So we're going to talk about a few framework legislations, some sectoral specific and some product-specific legislation as part of this. So it's important to note, first of all, that all of these different pieces of regulation come into force under the Circular Economy Action Plan, which is one key segment of the European Green Deal. So to start off with the Ecodesign for Sustainable Product Regulation, which is one of those framework pieces of legislation that we talked about earlier. This is a framework legislation that entered into force in 2024, but requirements will be applied on a product-by-product basis from 2027 as per the ESPR working plan. So textiles will be the first product group that will be tackled under the ESPR, requirements coming into that in 2027. So if you're interested in your specific product group, you should look at that working plan that was introduced in April of this year. So the aim of this regulation is to make products placed on the EU market more sustainable throughout their entire life cycle. And this is being done through setting minimum performance requirements and mandating certain information requirements with regards to each product. So the scope of this regulation, it applies in a horizontal way to all products that are placed on the EU market with product-specific requirements, as I said, according to the working plan. The implications of this will be that manufacturers will have to meet new sustainability requirements. So these performance requirements, so this can include durability requirements, life cycle requirements, repairability and disassembly requirements, provisions for energy efficiency and recyclability at the end of the product's lifespan. All of this is supported through the information requirements. So this has been introduced through a digital product passport. And what this looks like remains to be seen, as it will be set on a product by product basis, again, according to that ESPR working plan. Non-compliance, like Colin said, is quite costly. So products failing to meet the ESPR requirements may be denied market access, and enforcement through this will be done through market authorities, and penalties and market surveillance remains to be seen. The next piece of legislation then that we'll be talking about is the Green Claims and Empowering Consumers Directives. So these are two separate directives that work in tandem with the overall goal of banning greenwashing and misleading claims for products placed on the EU market. So the Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition Directive will outlaw and ban and prohibit any unfair commercial practices and misleading claims that will lead to greenwashing, while in tandem, the Green Claims Directive, which applies from 2027, will provide methodologies for how companies can make these claims and how they can back it up in a credible and verified way. So like we said, the aim of this is to ban misleading claims and unfair commercial practices and to substantiate how environmental claims can indeed be made. And these two pieces of legislation applies to all business to consumer environmental claims that are made voluntarily for products being placed on the EU market. So the implications of this will be that all companies will be required, with regard to the claims that they make, to provide clear, evidence-based and independently verified assessments where claims are made. So these must be done through substantiated methodologies that are outlined in the Green Claims Directive. Again, penalties for non-compliance are costly. They will be treated as an unfair commercial practice, and this will be enforced through consumer legislation and protection frameworks. So that's definitely one to keep an eye on for sure. Jumping back then to the more product-specific regulations. So the EU Batteries Regulation is one of these pieces of legislation that is aimed to introduce minimum requirements on performance and information for specific product groups on the EU market. So it's quite in line with the ESPR framework legislation, but it is one of the first that has come into place to really tackle a certain product group or a certain type of materials. So it was adopted in 2023 and phased in requirements are starting from 2025 up until 2030. The aim is to minimise the environmental impact of the obvious growing demand that we have for batteries through the introduction of circularity requirements. It applies to all batteries that are sold in the EU market, although requirements will vary according to the type of battery, but this will include requirements on portable, industrial, automotive and electric vehicle batteries across their entire life cycle. So this will mandate minimum performance requirements, the provision of information, again, through a digital product passport, and this will include due diligence information, so making sure that attempts are made to identify, mitigate against, and prioritise impacts relating to due diligence through the sourcing of batteries' entire life cycle. Non-compliance will include restricted market access, product recalls, and fines that are introduced through national authorities. The next piece of legislation then that is quite important, has been quite widely discussed through its development, is the Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulation. So this entered into force in 2025 and requirements are coming in on a staggered basis from 2026 up to 2030. The aim is quite obviously to reduce packaging waste and promote reusable and refillable alternatives through the introduction of circularity requirements in packaging. The regulation covers all types of packaging that is placed on the EU market, regardless of its material or origin, although different requirements apply to different types of packaging. And again, different sectors have different requirements under this piece of legislation. This includes business to business and e-commerce. The implications of this regulation will mean that certain single-use packaging and use of certain substances of concern will be banned by 2030. And the requirements include recycling, inclusion of recycled content within packaging, requirements for reuse and take back are required by 2029 or 2030, depending on the provision. Non-compliance include penalties, market restrictions and enforcement actions that will be taken by member states, and this can include bans on non-compliant packaging. The last piece of sourcing regulation, or of product regulation, that we'll talk about is for our friends in the construction sector, so the Construction Products Regulation. So this will apply from January 2026, and transitional provisions will be coming into place until 2027. The aim of this regulation is to establish a harmonised set of rules for the marketing of construction products that will enhance the market functioning, the safety and the sustainability of products that are being used in the construction sector. So it applies to construction products and different parts and materials therein. It applies to manufacturers, importers and distributors and online marketplaces, and the requirements for each piece of regulation varies depending on the actor in question. So the implications of this means that it will introduce stricter market surveillance, digital information requirements, and this can include environmental product declarations, clear responsibilities for economic actors, and then this has the overall goal of ensuring product compliance in a harmonised way across the entire construction sector. One more time, the non-compliant products may be subject to removal or recall from the market, and authorities are empowered to take corrective actions on sanctions opposing these. One final note before moving on, I realise a lot of the non-compliance actions I have mentioned are the same, and that is because in the EU regulations that are set out, it's left down to the member states to enforce what the different penalties and sanctions will be. The EU mandates that these sanctions must be effective, dissuasive and proportionate, but we'll be keeping an eye on what these all look like in practice as these different regulations are starting to be enforced. And with that, I'll hand back over to Colm to take us through the last few pieces of legislation, so with regards to ESG reporting.
Thanks, Orla. So the last two pieces of legislation from today's webinar. So firstly, I suppose I'll be covering the two closely connected pieces of legislation, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD, much publicised recently, and the EU taxonomy. So both of these are cornerstones of the EU sustainability agenda and have been reshaping and are reshaping how companies report and act on ESG matters. So firstly, the CSRD first came into force and applies from the 1st of January 2024. The first wave of reports have already been published and are being published, covering the 2024 financial year. It builds on the non-financial reporting directive, but unlike the NFRD, which applied to a smaller group of companies, the CSRD broadens the scope and increases the level of detail required by companies subject to its reporting requirements. This is all about transparency being the underlying principle behind the directive. So the key objective is to make sustainability information as important and as reliable as financial information. This includes detailed disclosures on environmental, social, and governance matters, so everything from greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity to labour practices and governance structures. So this implementation is being phased in. Initially, the CSDD applied to large public interest companies with 500 plus employees and either 50 million euro revenue or 25 million euro in assets. As originally drafted, the CSRD will expand to other large companies, listed small and medium enterprises, and non-EU companies that generate substantial business within the EU. The words "as originally drafted" are important here. Of course, as the CSRD is currently subject to ongoing negotiations about defining the scope and the implication of the directive, the EU omnibus discussions. So again, we're keeping a close eye on developments as they play out. There's new information and new updates every week with this, so it's an important one to keep an eye on. And again, keep an eye on our socials, and we keep our clients informed about updates related to this regulatory space. So the implications, like I mentioned, disclosures on ESG matters. When it comes to non-compliance, as Orla mentioned, the penalties are determined by each EU member state. In Ireland, for example, the current regime is that penalties mirror those for financial reporting. So this can include fines and restrictions or disqualifications of company directors. So it's a serious issue. It's not just a reporting exercise. It's a governance issue. So just again, a real important one to keep an eye on. Moving on to the EU taxonomy, it's a different kind of instrument to the CSRD, but similarly critical. Rather than being a reporting directive, it's a classification system. So the phase-in application. So it has applied from the 1st of January 2022 for climate change mitigation and adaptation. The elements relating to water, circular economy, pollution, and biodiversity are yet to be applied. So the taxonomy defines what counts as an environmentally sustainable economic activity. The aim of this is to redirect capital flows into genuinely sustainable activities and to help the EU to transition to a low carbon economy. It's really important because it ensures that when companies and investors can say something is green, that there's a scientific and legal definition within the taxonomy to back it up. The regulation entered into force in July 2021, but applied from the 1st of January 2022. So who does this apply to? Firstly, companies that are already in scope of the CSRD, they need to report how much of their activities align with taxonomy. Secondly, it applies to financial market participants under the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. And finally, it applies to EU institutions and member states when they're setting labels or standards for green financial products. The taxonomy regulation doesn't carry direct penalties on its own. Instead, it's enforced through related regulations such as the CSRD and SFDR. It means that non-compliance can lead to regulatory scrutiny, reputational damage, and investor pressure, especially if disclosures are seen as incomplete or misleading. So even without specific fines in the regulation itself, the indirect consequences can be significant, so it's a hugely important piece of regulation for companies. To summarize, the CSRD tells companies what they need to report when it comes to ESG performance. The taxonomy tells them what counts as a genuine sustainable activity, economic activity. So together, these two reporting directives and regulations are driving a fundamental shift in how sustainability is defined and practiced by companies within the European Union, and for companies outside the European Union who have business operations, meeting a certain threshold within the EU. It really is changing the EU business landscape. And if you have any questions, or if you want to discuss these further, please reach out to our team and we'll get back to you and go through it in further detail. So I'll pass it over to Kate to show in further detail how we can help you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Colm and Orla, for taking us through those 11 pieces of EU Green Deal Regs and Legs, as we call them here in Goodbody Clearstream. I think that was really helpful. We have a lot of companies we work with who are grappling with what's in scope, what's out of scope for their own businesses, but also looking up and down their value chain. And particularly with all of the changes and the omnibus, it can be quite confusing landscape to hear. Just on the omnibus, we are expecting news from the CBAM perspective, hopefully in July, and then for CSRD and the others probably later in the year, probably Q4. So stay tuned for those. Given that we've seen there's a lot of changes coming into effect or have just come into effect, and we know that companies are grappling with some of this, and we are working with a variety of companies in different industries to help them through this this period of change. But how can we assist you? In several ways. So we have kind of 3 distinct work streams that we are working through with various companies. The first is really around discovery and applicability. So looking at your own operations, your upstream and your downstream, and looking at what EU Green Deal and potentially other ESG legislation are relevant to your company indirectly or directly, and providing that applicability assessment. Following that, typically we'd look at developing a roadmap to compliance. So helping companies create a task list, who's responsible, and timelines to make sure that you have what you need for when you need it. And in some cases, assisting with implementation guidance on the actual creation of standard operating procedures, handbooks and training, etc. And a wider piece and very, very important, and I suppose today you got a taster of what that might look like from that really high level, is those masterclasses, trainings and workshops. So typically these are done at a high level management team or a job specific area. So if it's specific to procurement, we would come in and talk directly to your procurement team about what those implications are. So I know there's a lot of noise out there. Just want to say we are here to help you out of that noise should you need it. I hope you enjoyed and learned a little bit and kind of helped you in the headspace of where you might be in scope today, and which ones you can completely ignore. But thanks so much for joining. Thanks for listening. And please reach out, as Colm said, if you do have any questions. We will be sharing the slides and this recording. So please feel free to share wider and get in contact.